Hi, and welcome back to the Sound of Science. Today, we are going to be talking about Kingdom Plantae and Kingdom Animalia, the last two kingdoms that we need to talk about in our classification and taxonomy unit. Kingdom Plantae, that's where we're going to start. These are the basic characteristics that you find with Kingdom Plantae, and make sure that you've written down all of these characteristics. Plants are eukaryotic. That means they have a nucleus, just like everything else we've talked about, with the exception of bacteria. They do photosynthesis. They're autotrophs. They also have these cell walls made of cellulose, and they can reproduce with spores and sometimes with seeds. They're capable of sexual reproduction, and all plants are multicellular. There's a couple of important vocab terms you need to know when it comes to plants. Plants actually have something called vascular tissue, and this is just tissue that helps move things throughout the system. Xylem specifically transports water. Yes, that starts with an X. And phloem transports food. Plants fall into a couple of different types. What we really have are bryophytes, which are non-vascular plants. Ferns, which have vascular tissue, but they don't reproduce using seeds. They only reproduce with spores. And then we have the seed plants, which we split into two groups, gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms are things like pine trees. They have what we consider naked seeds. They're not covered by fruit. They're not covered by flowers. Angiosperms are our flowering plants. Their seeds are going to be covered by things, usually fruit. So these are the different types of plants, and you should know what they are. You should know their main characteristics. And that's really about it. That's about all that we need to talk about when it comes to plants. You're going to learn a little bit more in class. We're going to do a plant lab. It'll help you make a little bit more sense of it. And then after that, we are moving on to animals. Here we are at Kingdom Animalia, or the animal kingdom. They're eukaryotic, they're heterotrophic, they're capable of sexual reproduction. All of them are going to be multicellular. They're only multicellular animals. And at some stage in their life, all of them are modal, or able to move from place to place. And it may be just as a larva. We actually have animals that will become sessile at some point in their life, but every animal has a stage where it's able to move. When it comes to looking at their feeding patterns or how animals consume food for energy, we have a couple of different options there too: carnivores, herbivores, omnivores. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going over these terms. You probably have heard them before. Carnivores typically eat other animals. Herbivores eat plants and other non-animal items. Omnivores eat a little bit of both. When it comes to body temperature, animals can either be ectothermic or endothermic. Ectothermic means cold-blooded. That means that they need to use the outside temperature to regulate their body temperature. Endothermic, or warm-blooded animals, these are the ones that are going to create their own body heat. Humans, for instance, and all mammals, we are endothermic. We create our own body heat. Birds are endothermic. But things like lizards and reptiles, amphibians, all of these guys are ectothermic. They have to get their heat from their environment. This is why we don't have a whole lot of reptiles or amphibians living in the Arctic. They can't live in super cold places. They still have a range that their body needs to be at specific temperatures. Otherwise, the enzymes that they use for life processes won't function, and they have to have those processes in order to survive. So there's still a range at which a cold-blooded organism can live, but they're going to get their energy, or they're going to get their temperature regulated by the environment they're in. This is super, super important. Write this down. This whole diagram, you need to write this whole diagram down. This explains Kingdom Animalia, how the animal kingdom is split into several phyla, including Porifera, Cnidaria, mollusks, different phyla of worms. arthropoda, which are insects, echinodermata, chordata, and then how chordata is split into several different classes: fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. You need to understand what's a phylum and what's a class and what is a kingdom. So make sure you write this whole thing down. It's going to help you in the future. So pause the video, write this in your notes, and then we're going to move on to the next slide where we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth about these. The first main group I want to talk about are invertebrates. This is most of the animals in the world. All invertebrates are ectothermic, and they're all capable of sexual reproduction, but some are going to reproduce asexually as well. These guys can be really, really simple, or they can be very complex. They don't have a backbone or a notochord, which is another name for spinal cord. So like you think you have a backbone and you've got a notochord, you've got your spinal column there, your spinal cord. We're not invertebrates, we're vertebrates. That's actually the defining characteristic of the vertebrate phylum, is the fact that we have a backbone. So these are invertebrates. These are organisms that are not going to have a backbone. We're going to go through the next several slides and talk about some different invertebrates, different phyla of invertebrates. Phylum Porifera are the most simplistic animals we're going to talk about. These are sea sponges. Yes, like SpongeBob, except not yellow and square. I mean, some of them are yellow, but definitely not square, mostly. The thing is, they're actually asymmetrical. So they're going to have different shapes. They're not going to have a definite body plan, not all of them. But one thing that is true of all sponges is they're all located in the water. These are aquatic species. They're able to move when they're babies, when they're larvae. But once they attach themselves to coral or to the bottom, that's when they're going to become sessile. And that's actually when they're going to start to mature and grow into an adult. So they're capable of reproducing sexually, just like all animals. They can release their gametes into the water, or they can produce asexually through budding. If you think back to that SpongeBob episode where SpongeBob is like talking to Sandy about how land critters are not better than water critters, and he said, but can you reproduce by budding? And it's like little tiny SpongeBobs all over him, budding, 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 budding. So what he's talking about there is exactly this: growing an offspring off of your body. Let's all take a moment and be grateful that humans don't do that. They also have spicules and collar cells, which I've got a drawing of above my head, but basically what happens is you have these little these little cells that have these collars, and they have a flagella inside, and the flagella, as it moves, is actually going to pull food into those collars so it can actually be channeled into the cells. This is how sponges eat. These guys are filter feeders. They're going to filter food out of the water. The spicules are actually these really sharpened sections in the sponge. So the last thing that you want to do is just grab a sponge with your bare hands and squeeze it, because you'll end up potentially with cuts from these spicules. Some sponges are also very, very tough. Some sponges even have chemicals in their system that are like spicy to fish. So lots of times fish won't eat sponges because it hurts their mucous membranes, just like giving them hot sauce. Our next phylum are the cnidarians. Cnidarians are things like jellyfish, corals, and sea anemones. And yes, I know there's a C at the beginning of that word, but it's silent. It's cnidarians. Cnidarians have a radial body plan. And if you look at the picture that I have right there on the left, radial symmetry just means usually that it's round. And you can draw infinite lines of symmetry through it. So I'm going to point with my pointer here how you can draw lines of symmetry, multiple ones. This is going to be opposed to bilateral that we're going to talk about in a minute. And bilateral just means one line of symmetry only. All species live in water. All of them, all members of the cnidarian family live in water. They can reproduce asexually by budding or sexually by releasing gametes, which is pretty handy, because when the larvae form by those released gametes, that's when they're mostly motile. Sometimes as they get older, these guys become sessile. They find a spot to sit and just sort of hang out there, thinking like corals and sea anemones. But as larvae, even those organisms are able to move from place to place. In addition, all members of the cnidarian family have something called nematocysts. These are the stinging cells. They are used to trap food. Think about why the jellyfish stings. It's not an electrical impulse. And in fact, what I have right here is a video, which I'm going to play for you. And it's just a very short segment. What someone has done is they've taken the tentacle of a jellyfish or a hydra, something like this, and they've placed it under a slide and they're recording the slide. And then they just tap the slide and it causes the nematocysts to fire. So you can kind of see what they look like. So ready? And this is it firing in slow motion. Normally it happens so quickly, it's a blink of an eye. We're on to Platyhelminthes, or flatworms. This is one of those phyla of worms that we're going to talk about. These guys have bilateral symmetry. That means that you can draw one line of symmetry right through the middle of their body. Humans have bilateral symmetry. Here's a planarian or a flatworm. It has one line of symmetry. These guys are found in water. They could be parasites found in another organism. Sometimes they swim freely. Sometimes they're attached to tissue. These guys are able to reproduce by budding asexually, or they can reproduce sexually and then lay eggs, typically. They're also able to regenerate lost body parts. So they go through regeneration, which is kind of cool. That's actually what you're seeing up here. Here's a little flatworm up here. And if it is cut in half, it can actually regrow that half that it's lost. Tapeworms, the same way, it just takes a tiny segment of tapeworm to grow an entire new tapeworm. Phylum Nematoda, or roundworms, are also bilaterally symmetrical, despite the fact that they're round. These worms typically are going to be parasites. Sometimes they're found in the water where they move using a thrashing motion. They reproduce sexually, and these guys are going to have sharp teeth and hooks. And so if you look at that picture right there on the left, you'll see the hooks and the sharp teeth of the roundworms. You really don't want to pick up these parasites. They are not fun. They're not pleasant at all. And that's literally what their mouth looks like under a microscope. Finally, phylum Annelida. I don't know why, but every standardized test on the planet, I think, asks about phylum Annelida, and I'm not really sure what the deal is. We all just really like earthworms. So phylum Annelida, these guys are segmented worms. They have little body segments, and they have bilateral symmetry, but two openings. Basically, these guys are a long tube. This is the first group where the food comes in one end and the waste comes out the other. These guys live in soil in both fresh and saltwater environments, and it just depends on what species they are. And they move using these things called setae, and these are bristles on their body. It's actually these little spike-looking things right here. That's the setae, and it helps them pull themselves through the soil to help them burrow. This brings us to phylum Mollusca. Mollusks are soft-bodied individuals that have bilateral symmetry. Things such as squids, octopus, clams, snails, and slugs. Most of them are going to live in the water. Some can live on land. But regardless, they're going to use their muscular foot, their tentacles, or they might even clap their shells together in order to move from place to place. They reproduce sexually. There's not going to be asexual reproduction in this particular phylum. And you'll find that the more complicated the organism becomes, the less likely that is to happen. Many of them have something called a mantle. A mantle is just an organ that secretes the shell. Or they can have, they might have something called a radula, which is this tongue. Think like a cat's tongue, how it's nice and rough and it is able to scrape up food for them to eat. So that's the kinds of structures you're going to find on these. One of my favorite mollusks is the octopus and how well they can change color. You'll find that cuttlefish are also able to do this, but I have a short video clip that shows you an octopus in hiding. So you'll notice you can barely see the octopus. He knows he's been spotted. He's trying to blend in. And you'll see that how he started off completely white. Now he's adding in color, but only on the side where he perceives the danger. So he's going to start changing his color to try to blend in so that you can't see him. That didn't work. So now he's going to zip away and try a different location. He changes not only the color, but also the texture of the skin. And you see how quickly they are able to change their color and their texture. They're actually using something called a chromatophore, which is almost like little packets of ink under the skin that they can adjust in order to help them blend in better with their environment. These guys are wait predators. They hide and they wait for prey to come by. And that way they are able to blend in better, and they can't be seen by their prey. In addition, this helps protect them as well. And now here we are at the arthropods. Arthropod literally means jointed foot, which kind of makes sense for things like insects and arachnids and crustaceans. They have these outer exoskeletons, these hard shells around their bodies, and with joints so that they can still move. They're bilaterally symmetrical, so there's two sides, and they have a body plan sometimes with 2 or 3 segments. As they get older, as they get bigger, they actually have to shed their exoskeleton and regrow it periodically so that they can grow, unlike our skeleton, our endoskeleton that grows with us. These guys have jointed legs, some actually have wings, and they live everywhere. Insects reproduce sexually, and oftentimes they're going to go through a process called metamorphosis. This means that throughout their life cycle, they change from egg to adult. Sometimes their metamorphosis is what we consider complete, where they look completely different in the different stages. Sometimes it's what we consider incomplete, where they look similar, just larger at each stage in their life cycle. Echinoderms are the first organisms we're going to talk about with an endoskeleton. These guys are going to live in the ocean, typically. Starfish, sea urchins, and sea cucumbers is really what we're thinking of. They have this internal skeleton and a water vascular system. So these guys are moving by hydraulics. They literally pump up different areas with water to allow those areas to move in the way that they want. Body plan on these guys is radial. They are considered to be radially symmetrical, and they're able to regenerate, in a lot of cases, lost limbs. Now, obviously, if there's too much lost, it won't be able to regenerate that, but usually an arm on a starfish, they can regenerate. All species, like I said, live in the water, and they're all able to crawl or walk along the ocean floor, and as all animals, they reproduce sexually. So here is a quick video clip that shows tube feet in action. Tube feet are the little suction cup things on the underside of a starfish that help them stick to stuff. Just think in Finding Nemo where Peach is kind of pressed up against the glass and has to unstick herself in order to talk. So these tube feet work by filling them with water. And as you fill them with water and then take the water away, it actually allows it to grip onto things. That's how it causes that suction cup. So those are the tube feet, and you can see the water is flowing in or flowing out, and it's allowing them to move. And this is also, by the way, how starfish are going to move themselves along the ocean floor. They're actually going to use their tube feet to help them crawl. Finally, we have reached the vertebrates. So this is the second half of the animals we're going to talk about. All vertebrates are going to be bilaterally symmetrical. All produce eggs, so sometimes they actually lay those eggs. Sometimes those eggs stay internal, like with humans. Some may have live birth. All are going to contain a backbone with a notochord, with that spinal cord that's so important that we protect it, which is why we have a whole cage built around our notochord. Fish are the first example of vertebrates. Of course, found in water, they breathe with the use of gills. Make sure you understand what a gill is. It's where water flows over it and oxygen can be removed. Much like we breathe air in and oxygen is removed by our lungs, gills work the same way, just in water. Most members are going to be covered with scales. Some are not going to be. And in fact, we have one example right there that doesn't have scales. These organisms, of course, are ectothermic. They get their temperature from the environment around them. Three main types: jawless, which is this beautiful looking creature right here. And those rows of teeth do exactly what you think they do. They actually attach to another fish, a larger fish, and remove a section of flesh. That's how that jawless fish eats. There's cartilaginous fish. Those are things like sharks and skates and rays that don't have calcified bones. So they're very bendy, very flexible. And then bony fish. Bony fish are what we think of normally as fish. These are the fish that have calcified bones. Fish typically are going to use something called a swim bladder. They can fill it with air or deflate it, and that helps them swim either up or down in the water column. Amphibians are the next level of vertebrate that we're going to talk about. These guys need to live in moist areas, near water. Some live in water because they actually breathe through their skins. They may have underdeveloped lungs or gills. So here's the thing. Most of these guys are going to start off in the water with gills. And then over time, they may actually switch to lungs. Think like frogs. That's actually what they do. And as they switch to lungs, their lungs are not as good as the lungs of organisms that spend their entire life breathing air. They're going to reproduce sexually. They're going to lay eggs. These guys, again, are ectothermic. They're not able to control their body temperature. They go through a metamorphosis. Usually, this is going to be a complete one where they're going to change dramatically throughout their life cycle. These guys are also known as canary species. They help us know when there's toxins in the environment or where pollution is becoming a problem. These are some of the most sensitive organisms because literally they breathe through their skin. They're taking in those toxins through their skin as well. So they can tell us when an environment is becoming dangerous. Now let's talk about the class reptile. Reptiles may live on land, they can live in water, but they don't have gills. If they live in water, they have to come to the surface to get oxygen, to get air to breathe. Despite popular belief, these guys are not slimy. They actually have dry, scaly skin. Now, frogs are covered in mucus. All amphibians have a mucus covering that helps protect them, and that makes them feel slimy. But these guys are going to have dry skin. Anytime that you've touched a reptile and you're like, ooh, it's slimy, usually what's happened is because they're ectothermic, they are sometimes in certain environments, they actually might develop condensation that can make them feel a little bit on the slimy side, but they're really not. These guys lay soft eggs. You know how chicken eggs have the hard shell on the outside? These guys are going to lay eggs that are leathery. They feel like leather. They're soft. They're squishy. Very, very few have live birth, but a couple do. Now let's move to our first endothermic group, birds. Again, this is part of the phylum Chordata. These are vertebrates. Birds are in class Aves, and they can live in pretty much any environment. They're going to breathe air using their lungs. They're covered in feathers. Birds lay eggs. They have to keep their eggs warm, and they use their endothermic bodies to do so. Most birds do fly, however, some don't, like emus and ostriches and penguins. Those that do fly are going to have these ridiculously well-developed chest muscles and hollow bones that will make them much lighter. Without those things, they can't really achieve flight. Some birds migrate. That means they're going to move between the breeding and the feeding location. So they have one spot they go to, and that's where they're going to breed, and the rest of the locations they go to is where they're going to go to feed. And finally, mammals, the other endothermic organisms. We're mammals. This is where we're classified in class Mammalia. Mammals live on land. Some will live in water, but they all breathe using lungs. So again, these are groups that have to surface in order to breathe. We either have hair or fur covering our bodies. We can generate our own body heat, which means we're endothermic. They give birth to live young, and they're able to feed their live young with milk. This is, again, a couple of rare exceptions to this. Mammals also have specialized teeth for the foods that we consume, and a fairly well-developed brain. These definitions are incredibly important. Remember, I told you that some mammals do lay eggs? Monotremes. Monotremes are the mammals that lay eggs. These guys are things like the platypus. Marsupials, these are mammals that have a pouch for their offspring to live in because they're not born well developed. Nematocyst, stinging cells and cnidarians, we talked about that. Exoskeletons, we talked about. Tube feet, we've talked about as well. The radula, and what it means to be a filter feeder. If you didn't write down this vocabulary as you were going through, take the time to write it down now. You need this vocabulary in order to do well on the next couple of assignments and the test that's coming up. This also has brought us to the end of this particular set of notes. So if you've missed any information, if you need to see anything again, just go back, rewatch it, write down as much as you're able, make sure that you understand everything we've talked about. And as always, I'll see you next time.